Welcome to the 24th series of the communication of events from the logic of sense. This seems a very philosophically dense chapter with Deleuze's eventual goal to affirm difference, or affirm what he calls a disjunctive synthesis, which is a synthesis between two very different events. Deleuze begins with the Stoics, takes them as far as he can, moves on to Leibniz for a bit, and then eventually lands on Nietzsche. Along the way, he'll criticize some points from Hegel, also Kant. It helps to get a bit of a background on this chapter from the books that Deleuze has previously cited, and one that he cites in this chapter. In the last series, he cited the chapter on Zeno from Diogenes Laertius's Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. And in that chapter on Zeno, you get a lot of Stoic concepts and theories. Also, he cites Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations, and that's also very helpful for understanding this series. In this series, he cites a fragment that hasn't survived in its totality called De Fato, on Fate by Cicero, in which Cicero looks at how the Stoics regarded the communication of events. And this is the origin of quasi-causality, which is a big part in this series. There's also another paper that I happened to find that I'll post a link to that looks at the influence of Cicero's De Fato on this series. Okay, so Deleuze starts with a look at causality, saying that the Stoics divided causality into physical causality, which is the causality of bodies in their depths, what we normally think of as causality. But then the causes of these bodies create effects at the surface. And these incorporeal effects can also be the causes of other incorporeal effects. He calls that the quasi-causality. He introduces the idea of destiny as primarily the unity of causes in depths and the links between them. These quasi-causes, causes from incorporeal effects, are also connected with destiny, but whereas the causes from bodies are always based on necessity, it shifts. The causes of incorporeal effects move from one of necessity to expression. So Deleuze is going to say that the paradox of the Stoics was to affirm destiny while denying necessity. Okay, so Deleuze wants to know, what are the relations that these events express between each other? And of course, the expression of events is also sense. Deleuze writes that the wise person has two ways to be free, which conform to the two poles of ethics. The first is that their soul can grasp the interiority of pure physical causes, while their mind can see the relations between the effects of these causes on the surface. From this, he concludes that quasi-causes also have an interiority graspable by the soul, whereas the effects of these quasi-causes have a pure exteriority. So the difference between mind and soul is interesting. The Stoics believed that the dominant part of the soul was the heart. So it's the heart that can grasp this interiority of physical causes or quasi-causes. And here I'd like to offer an example. This comes from the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. This is an example of a quasi-cause as well as its interiority. And there's one section in the Meditations where Marcus Aurelius is wondering why he should get out of bed, why he just doesn't stay in bed and stay nice and warm within the blankets and just do that. Then he starts to think about, well, what is the job of a human being? Is the job of a human being to stay in bed, or what is it? And this gets him to get out of bed. This gives him a rationale for getting out of bed. So we see it wasn't a physical cause that got him out of bed. It was this idea of why he should, because that's what it was to be a human. And we see that this quasi-cause came from an interior place inside of him. So there's an example. Okay, then he moves to look at identity and contradiction, and if that can be used to look at how events relate to each other, or how they express their relation to each other. And he's going to eventually say no, because the identity, it's all identity relative to a concept. He'll say that these are the rules of concepts and don't apply to events as such, because they make a contradiction of something, a negative thing relative to the concept. And Deleuze wants to get rid of the negative. He wants to find a positive affirmation between two different events and not attempt to relate them to a single concept. The way to look at different events is whether they are compatible or incompatible with one another, whether they are conjunctive, whether they come together, or whether they fly apart from each other. Deleuze looks at how Chyrsippus examined the hypothetical propositions that looked at conjunctions and disjunctions between different events, and say that Chyrsippus obviously wasn't relying upon brute causality for this, but rather was looking at non-causal correspondences. So he's going to use the example of a particular species of butterfly to highlight the difference between contradiction and incompatibilities. This particular kind of butterfly has a trait that it can either be gray and weak or black and vigorous. And rather than saying that the gray one is negative because it's weak, he's going to say that it is actually a positive thing because the grayness of that butterfly helps it to camouflage itself. And so the black butterfly is also positive because it's stronger. And so the difference between the gray and the black, they don't contradict each other. They're just what he calls alogical incompatibilities. So he connects alogical compatibilities and incompatibilities with non-causal correspondences. And he'll say that the system of astrology was the first serious attempt to look at non-causal correspondences, or alogical compatibilities and incompatibilities between different events. And this also comes from De Fato by Cicero, so you can get a little background of that there. So an interesting part of the De Fato is that Cicero brings in the idea of free will, and this connects with the Stoics, saying that the quasi-causality is no longer dependent upon necessity, but rather shifts to expression. And when you are expressing something as opposed to doing something because you have to, this implies free will also. And he moves on to Leibniz, who he calls the first real theoretician of the event. And he looks at Leibniz's concept of compostable and incomposable worlds, which was something we looked at back in the static ontological Genesis series. And the difference between an incomposable world and a compostable world is that there are predicates. The predicates of an incomposable world won't be in the compostable world. So, for instance, the world of the gray butterfly in the example given does not have a predicate of vigorous. So a vigorous butterfly in that is an incomposable world to the world of a gray butterfly. The predicate of a gray butterfly is that it's weak. So this is how the predicates in incomposable worlds are separate from each other. But his problem with Leibniz is that Leibniz looked at it as exclusionary. That is, composable worlds excluded anything that was incomposable with it. And this is something where Deleuze disagrees with. He feels that incomposable worlds do have a relationship with each other, and he's eventually going to show how incomposable worlds, although they do not conjoin, they're divergent with each other, but they can still resonate and still communicate with each other over a distance. Deleuze defines a composable world as a world in which the series converge, and an incomposable world is worlds where series that aren't composable with that world, they diverge. So he says that the relations of convergence and divergence are an intrinsic aspect of the logic of sense. He now moves into an example from Friedrich Nietzsche, that of his relations between health and sickness, and that Nietzsche looked at sickness from the perspective of health and health from the perspective of sickness. So Nietzsche affirms sickness from the point of view of health by affirming the distance that sickness has from health. And when there is no distance and he can't affirm that anymore, then the game's over. Deleuze says this is the procedure to look at sickness from the point of view of health and health from the point of view of sickness. And the procedure is life itself. Note that Deleuze's example is something that's extremely practical to Nietzsche. Nietzsche struggled with health his entire adult life. So this is not something abstract or intellectual. It was something very crucial to Nietzsche's life. And he quotes something from Ecce Homo from Nietzsche, which at the end of which he says that he gained the know-how, Nietzsche gained the know-how to reverse perspectives. So this is how Deleuze affirms difference, not by negating it, but by choosing to look at things from a different perspective. This leads Deleuze to look at three types of synthesis between events, and he uses language to exemplify them. The first one being a connective synthesis, and in language that goes like, if such and such, then such and such. And this is how a single series is formed or is connected. Their points of singularity gets connected to make a series. So the second kind of synthesis is a conjunctive synthesis, exemplified by the word and. And this is how conjunctive series go into one another to form a world. And the third kind of synthesis is the disjunctive synthesis, which in language it's either or, one or the other. Now he wants to know what is the difference between just two disjunctive events as analyzed as such, and a veritable synthesis between these two different events. And his answer is that the difference is affirmed, or the distance between these events gets affirmed. And they can communicate with each other, they can resonate with each other through this affirmation of their difference. And this allows the communication between incomposable worlds. So another way to look at the synthesis, this disjunctive synthesis, is to look at he says that there is a paradoxical element or an aleatory point that runs between these two uneven faces. It's always in motion, that the ideational part of these two different events, or what he calls also the nomadic, or the intellectual understanding between these two different events, is always decentered, and eventually it loses its identity, or if we're talking about people, it loses its sense of self. It loses its relation to the concept. And remember, this paradoxical element or aleatory point, he also called the quasi-cause. So it's the quasi-cause that gives us the procedure of disjunctive synthesis. The effect of a disjunctive synthesis is that the either or between the two things gets affirmed, so that predicates that normally get excluded from one thing get affirmed by both. Deleuze says the two things open up to an infinity of predicates between the two. He says that the communication of events replaces the exclusion of predicates. And he's given examples of a disjunctive synthesis in language before in these series on esoteric words. So like a portmanteau word like snark, which is a combination of snake and shark, it affirms all the predicates that belong to the shark, as well as the predicates that belong to the snake. And so this is how the events open up and are no longer an exclusion of predicates. Deleuze will also briefly mention Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return, saying that the ion has its own eternal return that's much different than the eternal return of Chronos, which is circular. The eternal return of the ion is just the return of pure events, which he connects with the idea of it, the event, in the instant that it happens, splitting and dividing into both the future and the past simultaneously. And he connects this with Nietzsche's eternal return. On the esoteric side, reversing perspectives is a key part of the education of a Kabbalist. They learn to see things from entirely different perspectives. But there's also a sentence in here which I'll quote, which to me relates to the thelemic principle of true will. What brings about destiny at the level of events? What brings an event to repeat another in spite of all its difference? What makes it possible that a life is composed of one and the same event? That's event with a capital E. Despite the variety of what might happen, that it be traversed by a single and same fissure, that it play one and the same air over all possible tunes and all possible words. All these are not due to relations between cause and effect. It is rather an aggregate of non-causal correspondences, which form a system of echoes, of resumptions and resonances, a system of signs. So this reminds me of the thelemic true will. It reminds me of Led Zeppelin's The Song Remains the Same. And a system of signs is also, of course, Kabbalah. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.